Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of our wonderful Seeing Through Photographs learners. We have a really special event today for our study center session. Tasha and I are very pleased to be joined by Mauro Restiffe, who you see here. And this is just something Tasha and I had been hoping to try out, a sort of new format for our study center sessions. I'm going to go through a few logistical details to start. The most important one is to know that for these, you're being recorded. So be warned, you're being recorded. And that is mainly so that people who aren't able to join us today can log on at a later time and listen and hear what Mauro has to say about his work. We will be monitoring primarily the question and answer tab with the help of Tasha and several colleagues, Adelia, Sarah, Bodenson, and Kelly in the behind the scenes. So basically, sorry, I'm just looking at it myself. So if you have a question for Mauro, for Tasha, for me, the best way for us to see that question is to put it in the Q&A button at the bottom. You can also upvote a question. So if somebody else asked a question that you like, put a little thumbs up and then we're more likely to see it. The chat function is really for you all. So we love seeing where you can chat amongst yourselves, but really the Q&A is where we're going to be looking for questions. And other than that, am I missing anything, Tasha?
I don't think so.
Okay. So what we thought we'd do today is we'd begin with a few minutes of talking about Brazilian photography at the museum, in particular, things that have been happening recently. And then in 2017 and 2018, we did two major acquisitions of Mauro's work. So we'll use those as if we were in our study center talking about the prints and the materiality. And the best part of it is that we can also ask Mauro to talk about the work, and you can too. So here we go. Howie, or Mitch, can you bring up the first slide, please? Or the next slide? Okay, so in 2005, the museum acquired these two works by a photographer and painter and furniture designer named Geraldo de Barros. I remember when I saw these works in 2005, I didn't even know what to make of them. The one on the right is a cameraless photograph. The one on the left is a self-portrait. But to me, this idea, what these two pictures suggest together in terms of how you make photographs with such an attentiveness to light and shadow, whether you're using a camera or not, and such an inventive and personal way of saying, this is how I'm going to draw my picture with shadow and light. I remember thinking, wow, I would love to know more about this person. And as we started digging into the museum collection, we noticed that in 1948, the museum had a visitor from another Brazilian photographer named Thomas Farkas. And the next slide, please. And this was a photograph that Thomas Farkas sent to Edward Steichen when he was the director of the Department of Photography at MoMA in early 1949. And he wrote this incredibly humble letter saying, I hope you find these pictures technically suitable, which of course they were far more than technically suitable. And of the 7 photographs that Farkas sent to the museum, one of them was promoted into the museum collection a little bit later in the 1950s. But the other 6 we didn't promote into the museum collection until probably 2013, am I right, Tasha? I can't remember maybe 2011. Anyway, when we really started becoming more serious about learning about Brazilian photography, traveling to Brazil with the group, part of a research initiative called CMAP, and I started to realize that there was that both Geraldo de Barros and Thomas Farkas were part of this incredibly dynamic scene that was happening, emerging and around in the late 1930s, early 1940s in Sao Paulo. So then when we learned that these two artists were part of this group, and the next slide, please, Mitch.
Oh, it's 2014, just to clarify.
2014, thank you, Tasha. It's good to know it was actually after. So I went to Brazil for the first time in 2012 and was looking not only at historical figures like Geraldo de Barros, like Thomas Farkas, and the center wall here, that suite of photographs, these are all by a woman named Gertrudis Altschul, who was a member of that same amateur photo group, the Photocine Club Bandeirantes. And so this has sparked an incredible interest of mine to start following the work of an incredible group of Brazilian scholars who have been looking at this for much longer than I have and teaching me about this work. And we will be having an exhibition next year that I'm researching a lot. But it wasn't only that we were interested in historical work. We were also interested in taking advantage of these trips to Sao Paulo and to Rio and other places in Brazil to meet with the artists who are living and working today. And one of the ones whom I met, I'm trying to think, Mauro, do you remember when we first met? Was it 2014?
It was 14.
Yeah, okay.
It was 14.
So I remember was it in the room you're sitting in right now? Was that the room where I came to visit you?
It's the same house, but now it's, at the time the house was my studio, and now it's the place where we live, and I have a studio in the back. So
okay.
It's the same place, yeah.
So I remember, taking a taxi there and getting out, and it's a wonderful neighborhood and being like, so Mauro, I've heard great things about you, tell me a little bit about your work. And this led, thankfully, to the next slide, please, to the first acquisition of Mauro's work, which unusually, actually, it was a gift. Most of our initial acquisitions were purchases, but because we were also pursuing the much more complex purchase that happened, or purchase and gift that happened the following year. These were two photographs that you had made in Brasilia in 2003 that came to us through Patricia Phelps de Cisneros, who's been an extraordinary supporter of Latin American art at the museum. Maybe, Mauro, do you want to tell us a little? I mean, I could talk about the work, but I'd kind of rather let you do it, if you wouldn't mind.
We both do it.
We can do it together, yeah.
That is good. Now, well, this is, this series, it's titled, the original title is Empossamento in Portuguese. I see that the caption here is inauguration, which was Empossamento.
Is that wrong?
Sorry?
Is that a wrong title? Should we fix it?
Well, it's translated into English, which I've never seen it under like these subtitles. But it's what the title means in English. But in Portuguese has also kind of a double meaning, because inauguration in Portuguese would be posse, but the word I used is empossamento, which is slightly different. In Portuguese, from Portugal, they use empossamento, but in Brazil, we use a different word. But this is photos I took in 2003 when President Lula took over power on January 1st. This was my first time in Brasilia. I had never been to Brasilia, and I happened to be in a city nearby in Goiânia, which is 200 kilometers from Brasilia, and I voted for him and was there at the occasion and wanted to be there. And the idea at the time was not really to make a body of work, was to register this moment in Brazilian history. And a lot of that I had in mind was the images of Thomas Farkas, of the inauguration of Brasilia itself,
Right, so just as a little aside, Thomas Farkas, that photographer we showed earlier, he had visited Brasilia in 1960 when it was first inaugurated as the capital city of Brazil. Sorry, just a little.
Exactly. So this is parallel to what you were talking about the Fotocínculo Bandeirantes and Farkas and Geraldo de Barros. So because I had met Farkas once, only once, when I was kind of curating a show in the countryside of São Paulo, and he was super sweet, and he showed me some of the original prints. And I was completely like taken by them. And like a few years later, like 2 years later or three, happened to be in Brasilia for the first time, and to take these photos. And one thing that for me was very important on this trip was to photograph Brasilia in a very specific moment, where, because it's a place that has been photographed for so much, that I wanted to have a kind of a turning point where the time and the aspect of photographing Brasilia on a specific moment would change the reading of the city. That was for me very important. And this was an ideal occasion, and to have this kind of a historical moment captured and registered in my archives. So this was my goal, to be there. And I think these images right now, they keep on have different readings as time goes by. They always went, when Lula was in charge, they had one reading, and right now it has a completely different one with the new president, and with what's happening in Brazil. And so this is it always reconfigurates, and it's something that attracts me a lot about photography, how it changes within time, and our readings of images. And so this is something that I like to pursue a lot.
I think, and the well, yes, I agree. Maybe we'll go on. So these photographs we were so pleased to receive from Patty Cisneros, but the next slide, please. We also were interested in thinking about a deeper representation of your work, because you're somebody who, you've done many, many things over the course of your career. And I think when you and I first started talking, and in subsequent years, the question was really, well, what's the best way to represent, we were so happy for those two pictures, but we knew you had done so much more. And I really loved these photographs that you had made in Moscow in 1995, was it?
Yeah, it was from 95 to 96.
And these were, I'm going to talk about these in contradistinction with the newer one. So as much as I liked this work, for a young artist who's still making things, it didn't feel right to me to say, okay, we're really primarily interested in this thing that you made 20 years before. Oh my gosh, 20 years before. So we kept having a conversation. You said, I'm working on something I think you're going to find interesting. And I was skeptical, frankly, because sometimes revisiting a body of work can be an incredibly generative, productive thing. And then sometimes it can lead in other directions. So what I was delighted by was that maybe, was it 28, 16 or 17, I can't remember, when I came back, and after having seen all these earlier Russia pictures from 95, 96, we met at your gallery at what was then Fortes Velasa Galapau. You remember?
Yes, of course.
And and it was this wonderful, huge sort of warehouse-like space. And on one wall, they had installed an example of your new work, which integrated some of these older pictures. Can we go to the next slide, Mitch? And it was just amazing. It was this idea of how you had respected this incredible body of work from 95, 96, and those in the new work are represented with these smaller framed and overmatted pictures. And you had combined them in various sort of more, I would say, poetic groupings with newer pictures that were shown without an overmat and at different scales. Can we go to the next slide too? And so the scales would vary, but what would allow a viewer to understand that you were looking at the newer versus the older work were these signals of how they were matted and framed. And the next one too, please. So maybe Mauro, you'll talk us through one of these and how, because it's an unusual idea of integrating older and newer work.
Yeah, the body of work I did in the 90s in Russia was very important to me, but I actually didn't know the extension of this body of work until I started to revisit my archive in around 2013, I think, a little before your visit.
Okay.
And I did, of course, had some of these Russian photographs printed, and then, but for some reason, I started when I, got a scanner, started to revisit the archive. The first body of work that I started to look at was the Russian pictures, and then I was.
Sorry, Mauro, sorry, can I interrupt? For those people who are curious to know what you mean by having a scanner, and would you like what physically what were you looking at? Were you looking at contact sheets? Were you scanning contact sheets? Would you?
Yeah, before then, before the access to a scanner, I was always looking at contact sheets and then going to the lab and printing some small reference prints to understand what I had of the material that I had at the time. But the thing is, when like these pictures are from the 90s when I was still studying in New York at ICP, International Center of Photography, and at the time, I did pick a few of those images from my contact sheets and printed some of them, and then they were there. They're sitting in my archive for almost 20 years, and then I started to with the use of a scanner, which is make things much faster and more accessible. I started to look at these photos, and then I was like quite amazed on to see those images in a new perspective and to actually see them for the first time and then to start to print them and to understand a kind of a body of work that I sort of not neglected, but I knew that there were some images there, but I was kind of very surprised to see how much of my practice was there from the beginning, So then this was something that really started to change my way of looking at photographs and also my approach to photography itself, because I understood something that for me was very important. That was that this fact that that our reading of photographs, as I mentioned before, changes a lot with time. So then, like, I started to pay attention to not only this body of work, but also some other bodies of other groups of photographs that I had that I saw. What for me was very important was that I was so glad that I took those photos and that I had them in my archive. And then I started to photograph much more, like much more than I. This was actually not 2013. I think it was 2010 or 11 when I started.
Can I ask you one question though? Am I describing this properly, that the pictures from the Russia series that don't have an overmat, that those are also newer images that you made in dialogue with the older ones? Whereas, for instance, and we have some installation views of your show at the Pinacoteca, where that is exclusively drawn from your archive, but not necessarily making new images. Is that true?
Yes, I mean in the Russian series, all photographs they're
Sorry, Mitch, can we pull up the slide with the garage museum installation? Just so people can see how these are installed in a space. Okay, keep going, Mauro, sorry.
Yeah, so like these, within the Russian series, all images that are with the white border, they are matted. They are from the 90s, and I like, for instance, they are very small, this size, and what I wanted to do was to combine them with the newer body of work that was commissioned by Garage Museum in Moscow, and to differentiate and to have like a different, like to emphasize the time difference between those two series, not series, but the two moments in my connection or relationship to Russia. I decided to maintain the Russian ones with the original aspect, very small, intimate images. And then the newer ones from 2015, 14, they would be, framed straight into the edge of the images. So, and then we started, me and the curator, and also the architect who was involved. The curator was Snezhana Krasteva, and Martin Korolon from Metro was the architect. We started to put together these groupings, and it was very special effect on me, like to see how the regrouping of images could have different readings for both the individual images and the group itself. So this was something that really caught me, that I had never done before, and started to play also a huge impact on my practice after that.
Tasha, do you want to read Pedro Lazaro Rodriguez's question? I think it's a good one, and I think other people will be interested in it with respect to this body of work in particular. Look, you're muted. Sorry. No problem. It's good.
Sorry. So the question is, why is black and white photography? Is this the one you wanted?
Oh, no. I actually was thinking of the one about architecture.
No, architecture.
The color one I want to get to when we look at the Pinacoteca show.
Sorry. So we know architecture is a reoccurring theme through your photographic process. And so can you say more about how you understand architecture as an element of human productive understanding and social process that matters in the established narrative established between perception, architecture, and historical moments? It's been upvoted several times, so people are very curious.
I have voted it too. I liked it too.
No, I think it's a great question. I mean, architecture is something that I've been visiting or paying huge attention from the beginning of my practice, and my relationship to architecture is not like, I'm not an architect. I've never studied architecture. I'm passionate about architecture. And I think architecture, as also photography, it deals a lot with, if we think about with history in a way, because it's, if we think about how what we have as documents of civilizations, or architecture also plays a huge role on this. Is what stands. Of course, it gets demolished, it gets rebuilt. But it's a huge part of our understanding of humanity. It's connect as documents. I like to think of architecture as also as a kind of a document, as a documentation, and as something that we keep on reassessing. And the way I try to approach architecture is through a more, I would say, a more warmth or human eye to it. I try to avoid this more cold aspect of architecture, and try to always have it contextualized, either by someone who is inhabiting, or a group of people who is inhabiting one space, or like in Brasilia, where you have a huge crowd that is taking over that specific site. And so I like to think of architecture also as occupied and as being alive. So this is very important to me. And then the use of photography to portray that, or to extract that human quality from architecture, is very dear and important to me. So even though I think
Farkas was very interested in that too, is like, how do you animate architecture through human perception, and photography was a big part of how they were doing that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, no, I think this is a great punctuation. I think, I mean, this is my interest in it. You know, I try to, and I also try to, when I photograph architecture, I try to bring it back to my understanding of photography and to also my kind of a style that I always try to keep a very, not rigid, but very already like set way of like a kind of a language that is already imbued in my practice, that it can be applied either to architecture or to portrait, for instance. So,
Well, it is interesting. I do feel like you know, that's one of the things about using a camera and still being able to imprint upon that. Your distinctive sensibility is you know, it's one of the things that I admire about your work. It's not easy. But there are a handful of questions. Maybe do you want to read Jana Riedel's question? And then after we talk about this, then I want to move on to the Pinacoteca installation too. But Tasha, do you want to read that?
Sorry, I'm going for this.
I think it's...
So this is Jana Riedel's question, going back to the series about Russia. Can you talk about your reason for going there and what you were looking for when you were photographing there?
yeah, it's in the 90s, I was studying in New York at the International Center of Photography. And then I met a Russian girl who took me to St. Petersburg. And we spent a month there. It was in the winter break, the school winter break in like December, January. And that trip really impacted me. It was something that it was my first time in outside of, you know, when I went to New York was my first time outside of Brazil to study, and then to go to Russia was another place that I had been for the first time, and it made a huge impact on me. Then I went back to New York, finished my studies, and then went back to Russia on my own to, you know, to actually like to revisit a place that had been very important to me. And I was like passionate about classical music, about Russian culture, and I wanted to experience more of that instead of staying in New York and going for like trying to find a job. Or I had the opportunity to be in New York for another year, so then I skipped that and went somewhere else, and also to photograph. That was very important to me. And so this was the main reason, and then this body of work was built upon those two visits, this 1 month stay in the first time, and then I stayed for another 8-9 months on the second time. It was like then I started to dig into the culture, started to learn the language, and to photograph. And yeah, so that was the main reason. And then in 2014, I was invited by Garage Museum to go back to Russia and to photograph. There was one aspect of the project was to photograph the renovation of the new Garage Museum space that was designed by Renkuhas, and that they wanted me to photograph that. And then also I proposed to photograph, you know, life in Russia 20 years after my stay there. And then we did this project that we just saw. And
It was
that's
a
that
great
moment.
project, and we're really thrilled to have it in the collection. Maybe we'll look at, there was a good question about black and white and color. And Mitch, maybe you can pull up the next slide, because I think this idea of returning to the archive is a really interesting one. Of course, all of the work that the museum owns of your work is in black and white. And so, Mauro, what would you like to do? Why don't I let you run through? We have these two slides, this one and another one of the Pinacoteca installation, and then we have two more slides of the Torino installation. So you want to look through all of them first, or we can narrate them however you like?
Well, we can maybe talk a bit about the Pinacoteca show, and
Sure.
then we moved into Torino.
Okay, great.
So the great thing about the Russian project was about visiting the archive, revisiting the archive. So I was, as I mentioned, I was very moved and impacted by uh, looking at photographs that were like sitting still at the archive and that I had access to. So, and then I started to think that this could be a reason or one approach for an exhibition. And then when I was looking at the archive images, I found one specific photograph that caught my attention. That was a photo that I took at the exact same space where you see the slide now, the Pinacoteca building, that I had visited in 2000, I think 2003,
Oh,
and when they were under renovation. And then I thought, wow, this is one image that I didn't even remember that I had in my archive, that it's about this space. And I wanted to put together a show that talked about archive and revisiting these images. And then I proposed this show to the Pinacoteca together with Rodrigo Moura, who was the curator, and was very well accepted. And we took like 3 years to put together this project. And then when in the middle of the process, we decided to, because the archive, my archive has a lot of different interests. I mean, I photograph a lot of things, different things, like from architecture to portraits to landscape to a lot of like art, like how I look at art is always present also in the body of work. So we decided to, at some point, to combine the photographs of my archive with paintings from the Pinacoteca and also from MASP, where Rodrigo Moura was the curator at the time. So the idea was to, upon this exhibition, to really emphasize what those institutions have in terms of collections, and also the artists in terms of its own archive, and to combine those things together, and then to display this in a very kind of unusual and unique way as we did for this project. So there were only black and white photographs, but that were combined with paintings from both collections. And then we
can
would
we go to the
always,
next slide just to show a little more of a close-up detail, some of these?
yes. So, you know, color, the paintings that were in color, they played a huge role in these dynamics of reading through the space. So there were three huge rooms that we used and combined all these photographs and paintings from my archive and their collections. So it was a very a dear project to work on, because we were both like looking extensively at my archive, but then also at the collections of both institutions, and trying to
Yeah.
create relationships and narratives that would dialogue with the photographs. So, and of course, this comes from, it derivates from the project that I did at the garage, you know, of combining one image next to another, and how that would like emphasize or have a different reading for both images. So this was also a very important project. Um,
Yeah, and then maybe we'll keep going into your most recent show that was just up last year, right? If
It
I'm
was,
not.
yeah, it opened, I think October last year, early October, end of September in Italy, in
Mitch, will
Torino.
you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Which brings a different kind of thinking about color into the.
So yeah, so this was not my most recent project, solo show in Torino, that when I was invited to this project, Nicola Riccardi, he invited me, he came to São Paulo to visit me because he wanted to propose a project for OJR Torino that would happen last year, that dealt with architecture. last year was the 100th year of the Bauhaus, so he wanted to have someone that would deal with that. And then my name was proposed, and then he saw some of my work, came to São Paulo, and then I I proposed right away like a combination of using lots of images of and combining black and white and color photos that would create a huge mosaic. That this is like what we're looking at is a very large wall, 40 meters long, that we covered with.
Incredible space.
No, it's huge. And then we used a front and back of this panel. Yeah, I designed, like conceived this. So this is a huge space that we had a panel built in the middle of the space, floating in the middle of the space that you could go around. So you had the front and the back with different images. So, and here I wanted to do something similar to what I did at that long wall at the Pinacoteca. The Pinacoteca long wall was about my family, was a portrait of my relationship to my parents, my brothers, my wife, my kids, on a span of 20 years. And here, what we did was like pick a lot of images from our archive that would deal with architecture. And we combined those with some new commission photographs that I took in Italy for also like, on 3 visits that I made to Italy to photograph like spaces that would interest me in Italian modernism. So,
and is there a cue to what the new work is? Like with the Russia work, the cue to the new work was that it wasn't overmatted.
no, in this case, I wanted to actually, I needed to have a dynamic or a rhythm within the wall that was very free. So there's no, it's not like the Russian project that I had to be specific on determining these are from the 90s and these are actual photographs. So here, the main aspect for me was to create a rhythm. So then I would scale the images according to the relationship or connection that would have to the one next to it. So and color for me was very important in terms of like dictating this rhythm, like to breaking through the black and white ones, and so it was a very also. And then the project itself, it deals a lot with architecture because it is a construction. It is another project that I also collaborated with this architecture company that I always work with, and a Metro here from São Paulo. And we designed like this space, or this space within the space. And that's what it is, like this mosaic of photographs. So. And one thing that,
yeah, keep going.
now one thing that I think that is maybe important to emphasize is the fact that like a project like this, or a project like the one at Garage, even though there are a lot of new photographs, commissioned new ones, they one thing that is that I like to think is like how those projects, they determine the scale of the photographs, because that's how like I usually now determine if one image will be 20 by 24 or 40 by 60 or 100 or or a large scale. This is all according to where they're going to be shown for the first time. So when I mentioned that this is also about architecture, is because it's also constructing or building these elements of images that would combine and create a narrative and to dictate a rhythm and an impact to whoever is looking at them.
I mean, I noticed Henry Cooper asked a question, and I'll say answer live. How involved are you in the curation or hanging of your shows? And someone else had asked about the decision to frame some things in some in black frames, some in gold frames, which of course I think also had to do with the existing collections of those paintings, and which maybe was hard to tell on the screen. But how would you describe how involved you are in curating your exhibitions?
I mean, I think that's the fun part, right?
Me too.
No, because it is. It's like we do, I have those projects, they happen when uh, we, we start to dig the images from the archive, and then to to obtain new images from the commissions, and then we combine them. We have them like all spread or printed on small versions, or looking at them at the screen. But then when we think about the space, that's when the thing happens, and that's
Mm-hmm.
when the activity starts to be more interesting for me. It's like to be able to combine and to dialogue and to, so this is like the show at the Pinacoteca was very intense. Like we had major meetings with the curator, then with the architects, and then of course, like to think about scale and the use of the space. So I'm always very involved, and
Yeah.
but I
Not
always
all
love.
photographers are. Just as a
Huh?
point of not all photographers are. Just as a point of reference, there are many photographers who sort of see their role as the maker of the images and not necessarily as building relationships between them through scale, through installation, um, and, and so I think you are, it's another way, something that distinguishes your practice, I think, is that you really do think about that overall experience for a viewer as a big part of what you
Yeah,
make.
I think that started like, a lot of photographers, they do work with, book projects, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I never really had that much of a passion about books, of putting a book together. My first book came out in 2016 or 17, and I was putting together many shows at galleries and museums, and really challenging how to present the work within those spaces. So for me, this was from the beginning a very important aspect of the work, like how it is presented in the space, how it is framed, and how it is scaled. And it's something that for me, it was very important from the beginning. And then also how it connects to other media, like in group shows, how photography is placed next to a painting or next to a sculpture. And I always had the benefit, or from the beginning, to be showing with artists from different media. So, and I think I learned a lot from that and started to be very interested in this kind of installation process, And
So the one thing about the color and black and white in the Torino show and your earlier work for Russia that's all black and white, do you ever make are you always shooting it either with black and white film when you make a black and white print, or are you ever shooting in color and deciding to print it in black and white? Or because there have been a couple questions about sort of technically what material do you use, what do you shoot in, and obviously what you don't have the option to print something in color if you shot it in black and white. So would you talk a little bit about your process?
yeah, well, everything is analog from the beginning to the end. So the prints, they're all silver gelatin prints, or the color ones are C prints. And color started to, I started to photograph in color like 4 years ago, something like that, 4 or 5 years ago. And it came to me naturally. It was not like something that oh, now I want to photograph in color. But I sometimes I do some kind of uh, essays for some publications, or I don't remember exactly how I got some tons of rolls of color films.
Okay.
And then in 2014, I went to Cabo Verde for the first time for a residency. And I had like a bunch of color rolls of films that I took with me together with black and white films. And I needed to use them because they were going to expire. Then I said, okay, I'm going to go to this residency and photograph in color and black and white. So what I would do, I brought two cameras, my Rolleiflex and my Leica, and I would pick from my bag one roll of film without really knowing if it was black and white or color. So, and then I liked that, and I did the whole. I
Wait,
shot
sorry, one clarification. You had color 35 millimeter and color square
both,
format?
both color 35, color 120, and then black and white 35 and black white and
So you would
white.
just load your camera without even thinking?
Yeah, without knowing, and then I would always be confused if I had a color one, a black and white one, and would always photograph the same way that I've always done. And that's how I like to, and then afterwards I would see everything, and then, to try to understand also the impact of color within the black and white body of work. So I have never done one specific project only in color. So
Okay.
all color projects that I did, they were combined with the black and white ones. So, and everything came from this. I'm still doing the same thing, the same practice of going to places with both color and black and white and picking the first
Nice.
film that comes from my bag, and that's how I choose.
So you're not envisioning it as a color or a black and white image. You're actually composing it with a neutrality of that.
Yeah, I mean, I try to approach the subject matter in the same way, even if I'm more shooting black and white or color. So there's no distinction when I do photographs. It's
Can
the
I
same.
put up two more slides that I'd like you to sort of respond to in this black and white and color question? Mitch, can we pull up the last two slides? The first one, because I think also for our seeing through photograph, next one, sorry. This is a detail of the Torino exhibition, which is beautiful. So when I presented, so one of the things that we do at the museum, when a curator is proposing work for an acquisition, we make a justification for that acquisition. And when we make this to our committee on photography, and they either approve or don't approve the acquisition, but we try to be so persuasive that they can't imagine not approving it. And one of the things when is we describe the artist, we describe the work that we're presenting, and we've been through all that. But another thing that we try to do is to situate each new acquisition on a historical trajectory, to sort of say, this is where this work fits in. These are other connections that we could make between this new acquisition and something we've had for a while. So when I proposed Mauro's work for the collection, one of the things I did was to look backward and think, especially with the Russia pictures, which is what the museum acquired, what other photographers were working in a similar vein or would be an interesting counterpoint to consider. One of those is the artist Mikhail Schmidt, who also looked to his own archives and to imagery that he made and that he didn't photograph, and he pulled this together in a series that he called Einheit, or unity, and the hyphens directly imply that sort of division and bringing back together. So that he's separating the syllables in German or even in the English translation. So this is one installation of a selection from Einheit. And the next slide, please. Not in a different way, but also related, I think, is Lee Friedlander's series, Letters from the People, where he too went back to photographs that he had made over the previous decade. And even though both of these installation views are black and white, the underlying images are also black and white. So just in case that's not quite clear. And Lee Friedlander noticed in digging through his archives that he could pull a veritable alphabet and numerical and alphabetical, including some specific words you see sin up at the top left there. But I was just wondering, maybe we could use this, thinking about diving into the archive, thinking about the question of montage and what you bring together, because there was another interesting question that somebody asked. But I guess what maybe before we get to the other questions is, Mauro, how do you situate making black and white images along this historical trajectory, or with these or other artists in mind? You mentioned Thomas Farkas obviously earlier.
Right. Well, black and white, I learned photography through black and white photography. That's how, at the time, you film processing, and it was a very practical thing. Was something I studied film, and at film school we didn't have access to anything at the time, because it was very slow and very low key in terms of equipment and access to film processing. And when I parallel to the film school, I started to study photography at a different school, and then everything was hands-on. We would shoot a roll of film, and then would go to the lab and process, and then start like making contact sheets and then prints, and I got fascinated by that from the beginning, and then built a little lab and was able to have like whatever I would want to do with photography, I could do at the time, because it was, I had access to labs, and so it was very hands-on. And then color, we would have to send films to process, and this was a completely different thing. And I did not have access to color film processing here in Brazil. And at the time, also in the 90s, especially, I think black and white photography was looked at a kind of more prejudice way. There was no color, was the transition to an art background. Like color was the especially the late 80s and early 90s, color was very important in terms of putting photography into the art world. And black and white was considered more traditional and more like much more related to the medium itself, and not to the art concept or to the art. And I never really believed in that, and I wanted to pursue the black and white because I thought that this could be, a huge challenge. And also there was not, specifically for me at the time, a distinction between what a photograph would mean if it was in color or black and white. I mean, both, there was not such a hierarchy. And then, of course, through the years, I started to realize that black and white, my use at least of black and white photography was related a lot to the passage of time, like how, this maybe atemporal, or there's no, this was very specific to black and white. And within my practice, I started to try to make use of that within my language and my vocabulary. And I think this is something that relates to black and white. And with color images is much more difficult to get that aspect, even though, and then,
because you think the color photography can't feel as atemporal as black and white? You think there's something that anchors it more in a specific moment?
I think right now it can, but back then, when digital was not around, it was more difficult. Nowadays with analog color, I think this atemporality, this no atemporality, it's more, it can also be emphasized nowadays. But back in the before the digital advance, I think this was more difficult.
So we don't have much time left, but I want to answer, there have been a few questions that have been upvoted that I feel like maybe we give you like a speed question, so you try to answer, in a minute. So Tasha, you want to ask some of the more popular ones?
Sure. So this was an early question that's been upvoted a few times about music. and how this person, David Mozeleski, visited Rio in the late 1960s, and he felt that music penetrated the whole city. Do you think your photographs are evocative of culture today in the same way?
You said music?
Music.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, maybe yours are have a different thing, but
No, that's interesting because these last two shows, I think when we conceived those walls, those long walls with images that would, or even the show at the Garage Museum, I think there was a lot about music reading of partitures or how do you call the music
Yeah,
scales?
musical score. Yeah.
Score, sorry, I said the partitura is in Portuguese. The
Yeah.
music scores. Um, and I think the modulation of those images upon the wall, I think it relates a lot to music. It's so that's the only kind of reference that I can think of in terms of.
But maybe, sorry, one other part of the question, I think what he was getting at was, in the same way that for him, Rio in the 1960s was sort of exemplified by music, is there something that photography allows you to do today that captures this moment as specifically as the music of the 1960s in Rio captured that moment? I think he was also getting at that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting question. Sorry, I totally.
No. I think those sort of synesthetic parallels are super interesting. So I'm glad you talked about that too.
No, I think this is, I mean, it's hard to, I think this is a huge challenge, a challenge question. I mean, I think as artists, we try to connect to what our time is, to the place and time where we live. And I think we do respond to that in a way that hopefully will relate to the facts that correspond to our time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I can think of my practice as something that connects to what happens in the world or in my country or in my city right now. And I think that's the huge challenge of any artist, to be connected to that and to respond to those themes and issues. But to think that this is true or not, I think only time can tell, or the future is.
Fair enough.
As the person who asked the question, when relates to Rio, the music in Rio in the 60s, of course, this was totally related to what that lifestyle was. And nowadays, I think we, as producers of art or images, is still very hard for us to tell. I think time has to pass and to really
I want to ask a question. This is actually my own question, and it's a cheat because I know that you have a contact sheet nearby. But I wanted to know if you could show that to us and talk about your selection process, or what you're thinking about when you're moving through your archives. It's such a big part of your practice.
Oh, I think that's a good question. I actually put
It's going to have to be our last one, but I'm glad. I think it's a perfect
No,
last question.
Well, I'll show you an example of a contact sheet that has different kind of color dermatograph markers, and they refer to different times that I revisited the same contact sheets. So I think the red ones are the ones, I don't even remember now which ones are the very first ones from the 90s, the original ones. But this is like a vintage context that I then keep revisiting from time to time. And then I'll say, okay, now I want to undermark like this one specifically. And then I get a different color and go. And so they have this also tracing history that they represent different readings of the same roll of film.
And there was one question about how you organize your archive. So maybe we can just finish with that too, because obviously keeping the negatives and the contact sheets and all this straight, it's a lot of work. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I came up with one myself. I think I came up with one system back in 2006, I think 2007, when I came back from New York on the second time I lived in the US. And then I realized I had to organize my archive, otherwise it would be insane. And so, I mean, it's very simple. I put the contact sheets in one, like, oh, like what do we have in the back there? Like those are
Yep,
the
in a
boxes
binder.
that have contact sheets placed in like, they are like right there.
Yep.
they, so the contact sheets, they are there and they're boxed, like numbered within according to each box. And then the films, the films themselves, they're placed in a iron archive, in an iron cabinet with the same number as the ones that are stayed there. That's in that refers to the contact sheets. And then all images that I edit, that go through my, that I decide to print or that becomes an art piece, I then, for instance, have this archival box that I get one negative, for instance, and I take the negative out of the print file. The print file, you guys probably know, is like, I think I do have one around here. Well, the print files, the negatives, they stay in this box, and then like if I open it, they have tons of, I mean, usually like 80 rows of films on each box. And then I get, like, whenever I pick one image and becomes an art piece, I take them out of the print file and I file them in these envelopes, individual envelopes. And then it has the title and then the reference to the box number and to the film, the film roll. So everything is very kind of organized in a way that I can re-access them. So yeah.
It's pretty impressive.
I
But
mean, that's the part of the process, of analog process, that I really like. It's like, this physicality and then the way I organize and relate to these things. It's something that I'm very passionate about.
Mauro, thank you so much. We are very passionate about your work. We are so grateful to you for taking this time to be with us and to be with all of the Seeing Through Photographs learners. It really, every time I hear you speak, I learn something new. So very grateful for the opportunity. And we thank you. We might, anyway. Very, very grateful. Mostly though, stay safe, keep your family safe. I know things in Brazil are challenging and getting maybe even more so. So thank you and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.
Good
Bye.
plan.
Thank you.
Ciao.